Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
On December 7, 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy conducted a surprise military strike on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The attack killed approximately 2,400 Americans and destroyed 21 ships and 323 aircraft. The attack was a preventative action designed to cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet so that it would be unable to interfere with military actions Japan was planning in Southeast Asia. The attack came as a profound shock to the American people and led directly to the American entry into World War II, as well as the mass incarceration of Japanese Americans. The U.S. government's process of removing thousands of people from their homes and incarcerating them in camps was exceedingly complex. It began even before the issuing of Order 9066, with the arrest of hundreds of Issei, first-generation Japanese in America, along with selected German and Italian nationals, who were then detained in internment camps run by the U.S. Justice Department. Executive Order 9066, once signed by President Roosevelt on February 19, 1942, would then set the stage for the incarceration of more than 120,000 Japanese Americans in camps throughout the United States. The majority of those incarcerated were placed in 10 concentration camps run by the War Relocation Authority. Executive Order 9066 authorized the Army to designate military areas from which any persons may be excluded, under the pretext that Japanese Americans were a potential threat to national security, despite the fact that 2/3 of those incarcerated were American citizens by birth, more than half of whom were children.
The process of relocating the Japanese took place over an 8-month period from March 24, 1942 to November 3, 1942. Japanese Americans had no charges brought against them. There was no hearing. They did not know where they were going, how long they would be detained, what conditions they would face, nor what would happen to them. Families were registered and given number tags to identify themselves and their belongings. They were told to bring only what they could carry. This included household and personal items they needed for daily living. Families were forced to leave their pets behind. The sudden upheaval caused extreme hardship for many who were given as little as 48 hours' notice to sell their possessions and to dispose of their property. Losses incurred during this time were estimated in billions of dollars.
Concentration camps was a term commonly used by U.S. officials to describe the camps at the time. Congressman John Rankin said on December 15, 1941, "I'm for catching every Japanese in America, Alaska, and Hawaii now and putting them in concentration camps." However, the U.S. government quickly shrouded the incarceration in euphemistic terminology to make the incarceration more acceptable. Even Supreme Court Justice Owen J. Roberts declared on December 18, 1944, an assembly center was a euphemism for a prison. So-called relocation centers, a euphemism for concentration camps. The detention orders were called civilian exclusion orders, and American citizens were referred to as non-aliens. This extensive and persistent use of euphemisms not only worked to sidetrack legal and constitutional challenges, but functioned to gain the cooperation of its victims, as well as deceive the American and worldwide public. Here are a few misleading terminologies and their true meanings. Evacuation means exclusion or forced removal. Relocation means incarceration in camps, and it is also used for release from camp. Non-aliens are U.S. citizens of Japanese ancestry.
By October 1942, the Army transferred inmates to 10 permanent War Relocation Authority camps. The 10 internment camps resembled prisons with poor food, cramped quarters, and communal facilities. Barbed wire fences and armed guard towers with guns facing toward the inmates surrounded the compounds. The housing provided was tar paper-covered barracks without plumbing or cooking facilities. A family of 5 or 6 occupied a single room of 25 by 20 feet. A bath, laundry, and toilet building was shared by more than 250 people. The living conditions in the concentration camps were often unsanitary, with families living in hastily constructed barracks near open sewers. The barracks consisted of partitions with no ceilings, eliminating any chance of privacy, especially since the camp had communal men's and women's latrines. Meals provided to the Japanese were meager and caused a great deal of malnourishment. Despite these poor conditions, programs were eventually put into place that improved the condition of the camps and allowed the prisoners to work for small wages. Workers earned an average of $16 per month for a 44-hour week, with slight possibility of economic gain. In addition, evacuees met severe extremes of temperatures in desert camps, such as Manzanar, which is located at the foot of the Sierra Nevada in California. Few were accustomed to the extremes of the area's climate, and the temporary buildings were not adequate to shield people from the weather. Temperatures exceeded 100 degrees in the summer and dropped to 30 degrees during the day in winter. In addition, the ever-present dust was a continual problem due to the frequent high winds, so much that the prisoners usually woke up in the morning covered from head to toe with a fine layer of dust.
As camp life evolved, inmates helped organize services and worked in camp offices, mess halls, hospitals, and schools. Medical care was provided without charge at the centers, with hospitals built on site. Education was provided through high school, with many of the internees recruited as teachers, and vocational training was available in connection with employment programs. Essential to the community, work opportunities were offered to make the fullest possible use of each internee's skills and manpower. Also located at the camps were stores, canteens, barbershops, and shoe repair establishments managed by the residents. Aware that the harshness of camp life could set off riots, the WRA allocated recreational activities, helping to make the camps more bearable for the internees. They participated in sports including baseball, football, and martial arts. At Manzanar, many prisoners personalized and beautified their barren surroundings by building elaborate gardens, which often included pools, waterfalls, and rock ornaments. Remnants of some of the gardens, pools, and rock ornaments are still present at Manzanar. Despite these activities designed to bring people together, family life deteriorated because of the communal arrangement for all activities encouraged children to spend time away from the family home. Many of these second-generation Nisei left the camps to serve in the U.S. Army, setting a distinguished military record despite the fact that they were treated as prisoners in their own country.
At the time, the Japanese internment was justified as a military necessity to protect against domestic espionage and sabotage. However, it was later documented that not one Japanese American, citizen or not, had engaged in espionage or any act of sabotage. Rather, the causes for this unprecedented action in American history, according to the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians, were motivated largely by racial prejudice, wartime hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. While there were some Germans and Italians interned for short periods of time, the Japanese were specifically targeted for internment. The racial prejudice included rampant anti-Asian and specifically anti-Japanese sentiment since the turn of the century. For example, because of race, Japanese immigrants could not become naturalized citizens until 1952, unlike their European counterparts, and were restricted from owning land or marrying outside their own race. Institutional racism prevented many of them from living in places of their choice, and employers barred them from choice jobs.
The incarceration of Japanese Americans, regardless of their citizenship status, starkly demonstrates that the state treated them on the basis of race and ethnic ancestry rather than on the legal basis of political membership. The incarceration caused an identity crisis, as many Japanese Americans were forced to think about what racial identity really meant, that is explored in many texts and personal accounts. While each experience is unique to the individual, Jean Wakatsuki Houston's Farewell to Manzanar is an example of one of the texts that explore the formation of Japanese American female identity. Houston was sent to Manzanar in 1942 when she was only 7 years old. Manzanar quickly became a way of life in which she struggled and adapted, observed, and grew. She recalls life at Manzanar through the eyes of the child she was, exploring her own fear, confusion, and bewilderment, as well as the dignity and great resourcefulness of people in oppressive and demeaning circumstances. She focuses on how the atmosphere of camp life essentially eroded the family unit, particularly between the Issei and Issei, the first and second generation Japanese Americans.
In Farewell to Manzanar, Jean Wakatsuki Houston explains how she and her family were one of the first families shipped to the internment camps and one of the last to be released. Wakatsuki Houston's family, being fishermen, were seen as a threat to the national security, since the government believed they would smuggle oil to the Japanese Navy. Her memoirs are not only her story but also the story of her family. Her father was deeply affected by this experience, and it seemed to strip him of his spirit. Although Wakatsuki Houston was only 7 when she arrived at the camp, the experience dramatically changed her life. She struggled for years to find peace within her own identity. She has compared this incident to a rape. According to her, you feel you must have done something. You feel you were a part of the act. It took her almost 25 years to talk about the experience.
I think it's according to the age that people have this different experience because it's what you know, your consciousness of what was happening to you and what you were missing out, in quote, the outside life. But, at my age, 7 years old and so forth, you just continue playing with your friends, and going to school. The difference for me was that everybody looked like me. And then, of course, I think for me, the biggest, harshest change was having to eat in the mess halls, because the dinner table in our home was the center of life, our social life, was to eat at this big round table with all of us eating together. And that changed drastically when we went to camp, because we ate like we were in the army. And I remember longing for like Thanksgiving or Christmas, because we didn't have that anymore. But I remember that feeling of emptiness because that had changed. I knew something had changed in our life, but I didn't know why. And then, of course, when my father came back, and he was totally changed, it was like my world had turned upside down.
Wakatsuki Houston's visit back to Manzanar in 1972 helped her come to terms with her experience. She no longer felt ashamed of what she had gone through. She realized the experience made her who she is. According to her, Papa's life ended at Manzanar, though he lived for 12 more years after getting out. Until this trip, I had not been able to admit that my own life really began there.
On December 18, 1944, President Roosevelt announced the end of the exclusion of Japanese Americans from the West Coast, thus allowing the return home of the internees. Relocation after incarceration was difficult, especially since prejudice still ran high in the West Coast. Many Issei never regained their losses, living out their lives in poverty and poor health. On July 2, 1948, President Truman signed the Japanese American Evacuation Claims Act, a measure to compensate Japanese Americans for certain economic losses attributable to their forced evacuation. Although some $28 million was to be paid out through provision of the act, it would be largely ineffective even on the limited scope in which it operated. On July 31, 1980, the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians, or CWRIC, was established to investigate the incarceration of Japanese Americans and legal resident aliens during World War II. The Commission concluded, Executive Order 9066 was not justified by military necessity, and the decisions which followed from it, detention, ending detention, and ending exclusion, were not driven by analysis of military conditions. The broad historical causes which shaped these decisions were race, prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. 46 years after the harsh conditions, dislocated lives, and pain, the U.S. government formally acknowledged, apologized, and provided financial restitution of $20,000 to each of the affected families under the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, which was signed by Ronald Reagan. President Reagan acknowledged that the incarceration was a fundamental and grave injustice. For these fundamental violations of the basic civil liberties and constitutional rights of these individuals of Japanese ancestry, the Congress apologizes on behalf of the nation.